Who gave you that ring? Because we both know you can't afford it. Fiona Prescott said it loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear, and she smiled while she said it. Amelia Sutton didn't answer right away. She just sat there, hands folded, ring turned slightly inward, while an entire room of strangers laughed at her. The manager walked over next. He didn't ask what happened. He just told Amelia it was time to leave. She said she was waiting for someone. Nobody believed her. Fiona leaned in one more time, loud enough for every table to hear. A real duke would never marry a woman like you. That's where we're stopping, right there, before anyone in that restaurant had any idea what was about to pull up outside. Before we get into what happens next, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you don't want to miss this. Comment your name below. I might just give you a shout out in my next video. The laughter hadn't even finished dying down when the first headlight swept across the restaurant windows. Nobody noticed at first. Fiona was still grinning, still enjoying the sound of her own voice, still waiting for Amelia to shrink the way she always used to. The manager was still standing over the table with his arms crossed, already rehearsing how he'd describe this later. Then a second light swept past. Then a third. One of the guests near the window turned first, more out of habit than curiosity, and went quiet mid-sentence. Another followed. Within seconds, the entire side of the restaurant had turned toward the glass, and the noise that had filled the room only a moment earlier disappeared completely. Outside, 5 black vehicles were pulling into the drive in slow, deliberate formation, moving with the kind of precision that didn't belong to anyone simply arriving for lunch. Each car bore the same emblem on its doors, a raven in flight, framed inside a shield, stamped in gold. Small pennants marked with the same crest sat mounted at the front of every vehicle, moving faintly in the harbor breeze. Fiona's smile was still on her face, but it had stopped meaning anything. She looked toward the window like everyone else, waiting for an explanation that made sense, and found none. The cars came to a stop in unison. For a moment, nothing happened at all. Just 5 vehicles, engines idling, doors still closed, the whole restaurant holding its breath without quite understanding why. Then the doors opened together. 5 men stepped out in the same motion, as though they'd rehearsed it 1,000 times, because they had. Their coats were dark, tailored, trimmed in gold at the collar and cuffs. White gloves. Boots polished to a shine that caught the afternoon light, and their expressions carried the particular stillness of men who took their posture as seriously as their orders. They moved without hurry. 2 took position on either side of the entrance. 2 more fell in behind them. The 5th remained beside the final car, waiting. Nobody in the restaurant spoke. Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped against the floor as someone stood without meaning to, just to see better. The manager's arms slowly uncrossed. Whatever he'd planned to say to Amelia a moment ago had left him entirely. He was no longer looking at her. He was looking at the door. The final car's rear door opened, and the man stepped out. He was dressed exactly as the guards were, only more so. A long dark coat embroidered in gold thread down the front, a sash marking him apart from the others, formal medals catching the light at his shoulder, gloves still on his hands. He didn't look like a man who had dressed for effect. He looked like a man who had simply come from somewhere formal and hadn't had the chance to change. Which, as it happened, was exactly the truth. He didn't pause at the entrance. He didn't take in the room the way a stranger might, searching for a table or a host. He walked in like he already knew exactly where he was going, and the restaurant seemed to understand, without being told, that whatever was happening here mattered more than anything that had been said in the last 10 minutes. Fiona took an instinctive step backward. The manager took one too, without seeming to notice he'd done it. The man walked past both of them without a glance. He walked past the table of guests who had been laughing only moments earlier, past the hostess stand, past every face turned toward him in some mixture of confusion and recognition they couldn't yet name. His attention was fixed entirely on one point in the room, and he didn't look away from it once. Amelia hadn't moved from her seat. She'd gone very still the moment the first guard stepped through the door, her hands still folded in her lap, her ring still turned slightly inward out of habit. She looked up as he approached, and whatever composure she'd been holding onto for the last 10 minutes finally cracked, just slightly, at the corners of her eyes. He reached her table and stopped. For a moment, he didn't say anything at all. He simply looked at her, really looked, the way a person looks at someone they've been worried about, and whatever he saw in her face answered a question he hadn't needed to ask out loud. He removed his gloves, one hand at a time, without hurry, and set them down. Then he reached for her hand. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It carried through the silence of the room easily, reaching every table, every guest, every person who had, only minutes earlier, decided they knew exactly who Amelia Sutton was. Who made my future Duchess cry? No one answered. And Alexander didn't ask again. He simply turned, and let his attention settle on the manager standing a few feet away. The man had gone very pale. Whatever authority he'd carried a few minutes earlier, when he'd leaned over Amelia's table and told her it was time to leave, had drained out of him entirely. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again, as if every possible sentence had suddenly become the wrong one. Alexander didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was already so quiet that anything above a murmur would have carried to every table. You asked her to leave, he said. It wasn't a question. Before I arrived. While she was waiting for me. The manager's hands moved slightly at his sides, like he was searching for something to do with them. There was a misunderstanding, sir. I wasn't aware. You weren't aware she had a reservation. Alexander's tone stayed even. Or you weren't aware it mattered who she was. The manager didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer that wouldn't make things worse. Which one? Alexander said quietly, because I'd like to know exactly what almost happened here before I decide how to feel about it. The silence that followed was worse than anything he could have shouted. A few guests near the window had gone completely still, watching a moment that would clearly be retold long after they'd finished their meals. Someone near the bar had their phone half raised, filming without quite deciding to. The manager finally spoke, quiet and clipped. It won't happen again. No, Alexander agreed. It won't. He let that sit for a moment, long enough that the manager understood it wasn't a threat so much as a fact, and then he turned his attention away from the man entirely. A small, deliberate motion, as if the conversation had simply ended because it no longer required his focus. His eyes moved to Fiona. She hadn't moved from where she'd been standing when the cars first pulled up. The color had gone out of her face the moment Alexander stepped through the door, and it hadn't returned. She was still holding the same posture she'd had minutes earlier, chin slightly raised, shoulders back, but none of the confidence that had carried it was left underneath. Alexander didn't say anything to her at first. He didn't need to. Every person in that section of the restaurant had heard exactly what she'd said only minutes before he walked in, and the 5 guards positioned near the entrance made it very clear that whatever she said next would be the last thing she got to say without consequence. You told her, Alexander said finally, that a real duke would never marry a woman like her. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words landed in a room that was already holding its breath. Fiona's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out of it. I didn't know that she was. That's the part that concerns me, Alexander said. Not that you didn't know. That it changes anything for you. Fiona's composure, the same composure that had let her walk over to Amelia's table and mock her in front of a room full of strangers, finally gave out completely. She looked, for the first time since Amelia had known her, genuinely small. I'm sorry, she said, and this time it came out fast, almost tripping over itself. Amelia, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean. She reached toward Amelia's arm, and that was the moment Amelia finally moved. She stood up from the table, unhurried, and gently stepped back so that Fiona's hand met nothing but air. Don't, Amelia said. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't loud. But it was the first thing she'd said in the last 10 minutes that carried any real weight, and the whole room seemed to lean toward it. Fiona froze. I just want to apologize. I don't need your apology. Amelia's voice stayed level. I needed my dignity back. And I never actually lost it. You did. For a moment, nobody in the restaurant moved. Fiona stood there with her hands still half extended, and there was nothing left in her expression except the slow, uncomfortable understanding that everyone around her had just watched her lose an argument she hadn't realized she was having. Amelia didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or draw the moment out longer than it needed to be. She simply turned, calm and unbothered, and looked up at Alexander, not for rescue, but because he was the person she'd been waiting for all along, guards and crest and ceremonial coat aside. Alexander looked back at her the way he had the moment he'd first walked through the door. Like nothing else in the room mattered nearly as much. Come on, he said quietly, offering his arm. Let's go somewhere quieter. He glanced once more at the manager as they turned to leave, a look that needed no further explanation, and then the two of them walked toward the private dining room together, leaving behind a restaurant full of people who were only now beginning to understand exactly who Amelia Sutton was. The private dining room was smaller than the main floor, tucked behind a set of frosted glass doors that muted most of the sound from outside. The moment those doors closed, the noise of the restaurant, the murmurs, the phones half raised, the manager still trying to compose himself near the entrance, disappeared almost entirely, and for the first time in nearly half an hour, Amelia let her shoulders drop. Alexander pulled out a chair for her, then took the one across from it, setting his gloves down on the table between them. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that only exists between two people who don't need to fill every second of it. Amelia was the one who finally spoke. You're still in your ceremonial coat, she said, studying him properly now that there was no one else in the room to watch her do it. I've never actually seen you dressed like this outside of a photograph. Alexander glanced down at the gold embroidery along his sleeve, almost as if he'd forgotten it was there. I came straight from an engagement this morning. There wasn't time to change before lunch. An engagement. An official one, he said. A ceremony I couldn't move and couldn't shorten, no matter how much I wanted to. He paused. I told you I might run late. I didn't expect to run this late, or to walk in on what I walked in on. Amelia looked down at her hands for a moment. You didn't miss much. Just Fiona reminding an entire restaurant that my family doesn't matter anymore, and a manager who agreed with her enough to ask me to leave. I know, Alexander said quietly. I saw enough of it before I said anything. She looked up at that. You were watching before you came in. Long enough to know I wasn't overreacting. His jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of how much that had cost him to watch and not act sooner. I'm sorry I wasn't here before it started. That was supposed to be an ordinary lunch. I promised you one quiet afternoon before everything changes, and instead you sat through that alone. I wasn't entirely alone, Amelia said. I knew you were coming. Not soon enough. Soon enough, she said, and meant it. You came exactly when it mattered. He reached across the table and took her hand again, the way he had the moment he'd first walked through the restaurant doors, except this time there was no room full of strangers watching, no crest, no ceremony, just the two of them and a door that muted everything else out. I need you to know something, he said. None of this, the cars, the coat, any of it. That's not who I am with you. That's who I have to be everywhere else. I know that. I don't think you always let yourself believe it, he said. Not really. I've watched you flinch every time someone brings up the title, like you're waiting for the moment it changes how I look at you. Amelia didn't answer right away. It was true, and they both knew it. 3 years of watching people disappear from her life the moment her family stopped being useful to them had taught her to expect it from everyone eventually. Even him, even now. You have to understand what today looked like from where I was sitting, she said finally. Everyone in that room decided who I was in about 30 seconds. My dress, my ring, the fact that I don't have the name I used to have. None of it mattered. They'd already made up their minds. And what did I do the moment I walked in? You didn't ask any of that, she admitted. You didn't care what I looked like or what anyone else in that room thought they knew about me. Because none of that has ever been what mattered to me. He held her hand a little tighter. I didn't fall in love with your family's money, Amelia. I fell in love with you. With the woman who kept showing up to that design studio every morning instead of waiting for someone to hand her back a life she used to have. That's who I proposed to. That's who I'm marrying. Amelia felt her eyes sting for the second time that afternoon, though this time it had nothing to do with humiliation. Most people would have said that a long time ago, if it were true. Most people didn't need to prove anything, Alexander said. I needed you to believe it without being told. And I think, until about an hour ago, you didn't quite let yourself. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. It's hard to believe you're worth choosing when everyone spends 3 years proving you're not. They were wrong, he said simply. About all of it. More than you know. Something in the way he said it made Amelia go still. It wasn't the tone of a man offering comfort. It was the tone of someone about to say something he'd been carrying for a while. What do you mean, more than I know? Alexander held her gaze for a long moment, as though deciding exactly how to begin. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Something I've known for a while now, and haven't found the right moment to say. Amelia didn't move. She just waited. Your grandfather, he said. Before he passed. He set something up. A trust. Structured so no one outside a small circle of trustees would ever know it existed. Silence. Then a question, careful and quiet. What kind of trust? The kind that doesn't show up in probate records, Alexander said. Under English trust law, a settler can place assets into a discretionary trust that's never made public. No names, no filings anyone can search. It sits there, invisible, unless the trustees decide to reveal it. Amelia's hand went still in his. He did that, Alexander continued. Years ago. Long before your family's fortunes changed. He built something quiet and untouched, and he made sure it would sit there waiting, whether or not you ever needed it. Waiting for what? For you, he said. You're the sole beneficiary. The words landed slowly. Amelia sat with them the way someone sits with news too large to process in one motion. 3 years. 3 years of watching people disappear the moment her father's health failed. 3 years of a design studio paycheck and a small apartment and friends who stopped calling. And the entire time, none of it had been necessary. Why didn't he tell me? Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. I don't know, Alexander said. Maybe he wanted to see who you'd become without it. Maybe he simply ran out of time. He paused. I only learned about it myself a few months ago, going through matters ahead of the wedding. I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you. This wasn't it. But I didn't want you walking out of that room today still believing you had nothing. Amelia let out a breath that shook slightly on the way out. Not from relief. From something closer to grief. Do you understand what this means? She said, more to herself than to him. I sat in that restaurant and let a room full of people believe I couldn't afford to be there. I let Fiona believe her version of me was true. And the entire time. You had every reason to prove her wrong, Alexander said. And you didn't. I didn't need to. No, he said. You didn't. That's the part one need you to hear. You weren't hiding because you had nothing. You were choosing not to use what you had to buy back people who never deserved you in the first place. Amelia looked down at her hands. Steady now. Barely. This is the part worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy to miss. Most people, given a secret fortune and a room full of critics, would have used it the moment they had the chance. Amelia didn't know she had one. But even if she had, something tells you she still wouldn't have reached for it. That's not weakness. That's restraint most people never learn. 3 years, she said quietly. 3 years of watching people I loved disappear, and I never once thought about proving them wrong. I just wanted them to come back because they missed me, not because I suddenly mattered again. That's what separates them from you, Alexander said. They only ever valued what you had. You never once asked to be valued for it. Amelia sat back slightly, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The room was quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the restaurant beyond the glass doors. A world that, an hour ago, had decided exactly who she was, and had gotten every part of it wrong. What happens now? She asked. Now, Alexander said, the world finds out who you actually are. Not the version Fiona built. Not the version your relatives told themselves so they could feel better about disappearing. The real one. Amelia didn't answer right away. Something had shifted in her. Quiet, but permanent. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself with tears or triumph. Just a settling. A woman who had spent 3 years absorbing every quiet insult without flinching. Finally understanding she'd never needed to absorb a single one of them. Outside the private room, a phone was already circulating footage of 5 guards standing at attention outside a Charleston restaurant. By evening, it would reach people who hadn't thought about Amelia Sutton in years. She had no idea yet how fast that door was about to open, or how many people who'd once looked straight through her were about to come knocking, asking to be let back in. By 6 o'clock that evening, the video was everywhere. Nobody in the restaurant had filmed it on purpose. It started as a shaky 10-second clip, 5 black cars, a line of guards, a man in a gold-embroidered coat walking through a dining room like he owned the air in it. Someone posted it with a caption that read Duke walks into a Charleston restaurant and the whole room goes silent. By midnight, it had been reposted enough times that nobody could trace who'd filmed it first. Then came the second clip. Someone had caught the tail end of it. Fiona's face, pale and frozen, and a woman's voice saying, calm and clear, I don't need your apology. I needed my dignity back. That clip moved faster than the first one. People clipped it into 15-second loops. Somebody set it to music. By morning, strangers were asking the only question that mattered to them. Who is she? It didn't take long to find out. A name. A photo from years earlier, when the Sutton family still had a seat at every table in Charleston. Someone dug up an old Society page article about her father. Someone else found her design studio, tagged it, and within an hour her manager's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Amelia found out about all of it secondhand, from a friend who called sounding half panicked, half thrilled. Have you seen this? Have you seen how many people are talking about you? She hadn't. She'd spent the morning at the studio, sketching layouts for a client's kitchen renovation. Exactly the way she had every morning for the last 3 years. It was strange to learn that the version of her life she'd built quietly, without anyone watching, had suddenly become the most interesting thing in a stranger's phone. By the afternoon, the calls started. Not from strangers. From people she knew. An aunt who hadn't spoken to her in 3 years left a voicemail asking how she'd been, as though the silence between them had simply been an oversight. A cousin who'd once crossed the street to avoid her sent a text with 3 exclamation points and a string of hearts. A woman who used to host garden parties Amelia's mother had been quietly uninvited from called the studio directly, asking to speak with her, sounding warm enough that a stranger might have believed they'd always been close. Gifts started arriving before the week was out. A bottle of wine from a family who hadn't acknowledged her existence at her father's worst. A card from a former neighbor, handwritten, full of the kind of affection that hadn't existed 3 years earlier when Amelia genuinely needed it. She sat with all of it at her kitchen table one evening, a small pile of cards and messages in front of her, and felt something colder than anger. It wasn't betrayal, exactly. Betrayal requires a bond that actually existed. This was something closer to recognition. She was watching, in real time, exactly how conditional all of it had been. Here's the part worth noticing. If you've ever wondered how fast people can change their tune once the value goes up, none of these people had changed at all. Not one. They hadn't looked at what happened in that restaurant and thought we were wrong about her. They'd looked at the cars and the crest and thought we were wrong about the return on knowing her. That's not remorse. That's arithmetic. Amelia scrolled through message after message that same night. Some she'd expected, most she hadn't, and noticed the pattern immediately. Every single one used the same words. So happy for you. We always knew you'd land on your feet. Let's catch up soon. Interchangeable sentences from interchangeable people, all of them written by someone who disappeared the moment her family stopped being useful and reappeared the moment it suddenly was again. She didn't answer any of them that night. She just sat there, phone in hand, watching notification after notification stack up, and felt the full weight of something she hadn't let herself feel in 3 years. Not sadness. Clarity. Somewhere in London, Alexander was fielding a very different kind of message. Calls from his own family, questions about timing, about the wedding, about a woman the tabloids had already started calling the Duchess Charleston forgot. But that was a conversation for another day. Tonight, Amelia had her own reckoning to get through first. And unlike the people flooding her phone, she wasn't interested in pretending the last 3 years hadn't happened. She started answering the messages 3 days later, once the calls had thinned out enough that she could tell which ones actually mattered. Her aunt was the first. Amelia called back during her lunch break, sitting on the low wall outside the design studio, and let the woman talk for almost a full minute before saying anything. Her aunt's voice was warm, rehearsed, full of "We've missed you and we should have called sooner." "You had 3 years to call sooner," Amelia said, once there was finally a pause. "Nothing about my number changed." Silence on the other end. "I'm not angry," Amelia continued, and she meant it. "I just don't think we need to pretend this is a reunion. You didn't miss me. You missed what people are saying about me now." Her aunt tried to object, but there wasn't much conviction behind it. Amelia let her finish, thanked her for calling, and ended it there. No drama, no raised voice, just a door quietly closing on a relationship that had already ended long before this phone call started. The cousin was easier. A single text, sent back after 2 days of silence. "Thank you for reaching out. I don't think we have much to catch up on." No further explanation. None was owed. The woman who'd once hosted garden parties took slightly more patience, mostly because she called the studio 3 separate times before Amelia agreed to speak with her. When she finally did, the woman spent most of the call describing how much she'd always admired Amelia's composure, how she'd always known there was something special about her, how she hoped they could rebuild what they'd once had. "We never had anything to rebuild," Amelia told her. "You stopped inviting my mother the same month my father got sick. I remember exactly which month it was." There wasn't a response to that worth repeating. One by one, she went through them, not cruelly, not with any raised voice or dramatic declaration, just a series of short, clear conversations that ended the same way every time. Gratitude for the gesture, and no interest in continuing it. She didn't need to humiliate anyone the way she'd been humiliated. She simply stopped pretending 3 years of silence could be erased by 1 week of good news. Fiona was the last one to try. It came as a message first, long and carefully worded, full of apologies that used words like misunderstanding and context instead of anything closer to the truth. Amelia read it twice, then set the phone down without responding. Fiona tried again 2 days later, this time in person, waiting outside the studio when Amelia left for the evening. She looked smaller than she had in the restaurant, without the crowd behind her, without the confidence that had let her mock a woman she'd once called a friend. "I know you probably don't want to hear this," Fiona started, "but I really am sorry. I said things I shouldn't have. I let embarrassment turn into cruelty, and I know that's not an excuse." Amelia listened. She let her finish completely, which was more patience than Fiona had shown her in that restaurant. "I believe you're sorry," Amelia said finally. "I don't think you're sorry for what you said, though. I think you're sorry it turned out to matter." Fiona opened her mouth, then closed it again. "If I'd walked in there with nothing," Amelia continued, "if there'd been no cars outside, no guards, none of it, you wouldn't be standing here right now. And we both know that." She didn't say it with anger. That was the part that seemed to land hardest. That after everything, Amelia still wasn't shouting, still wasn't reaching for the same cruelty that had been aimed at her only days earlier. She simply meant every word, calmly, and let it sit there. "I hope things go well for you," Amelia said. "I mean that. But I don't think we need to be in each other's lives anymore." She walked past her without waiting for a response, because there wasn't one that would have changed anything. What people didn't expect, what surprised even the studio staff who'd watched her field call after call that week, was how little any of it changed her day to day. She still greeted the same barista by name every morning. She still tipped the same delivery driver the same amount she always had, long before anyone knew who she was engaged to. She still stayed 20 minutes late helping a client who couldn't afford the studio's full rate. The same as she had the week before the restaurant, the same as she would the week after. That, more than anything, was the part nobody flooding her phone with apologies had understood. She hadn't changed because her circumstances had. She'd simply stopped letting people who only valued the circumstances stay close enough to matter. 3 weeks later, Amelia was in a guest suite in a stone hall in London, 400 years older than anything she'd ever stood inside back home. "Say it again," she whispered to Alexander, smoothing the front of her dress with both hands. "Just so I know I'm not imagining this." He adjusted the cuff of his coat, watching her instead of the mirror. "You're about to become a duchess. In front of 300 people. In about 4 minutes. She laughed, but her hands were shaking. The hall was enormous. Old stone. Gold light. Rows of guests seated beneath banners that had hung in that same room for over a century. Amelia had never stood anywhere like it in her life, and 3 weeks ago, she'd been sitting alone at a restaurant table, waiting to be told to leave. Here's something worth knowing before we go further. In British aristocratic tradition, a title like Duke isn't simply inherited wealth. It's tied to something called letters patent, a formal legal document from the Crown that defines exactly how a title passes, who can hold it, and what obligations come with it. It's not a name. It's a contract with history. Alexander wasn't just marrying Amelia. He was making her part of that contract, permanently, in front of witnesses who understood exactly what that meant. Amelia didn't know any of that yet. She just knew her heart was pounding. The doors opened. Every head turned. She walked in on Alexander's arm, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was her own heartbeat in her ears. Faces she didn't recognize. A few she did, distant cousins seated near the back, watching with the same hungry curiosity that had followed her since the restaurant video went public. The same people whose calls she'd already closed the door on, one by one, weeks earlier. They reached the front. Alexander turned to face the room. "Most of you know why we're here," he said. His voice carried without effort, the way it had that day in Charleston. "Some of you know Amelia already. Some of you have only just learned her name." A pause. Long enough to feel deliberate. "A few of you," he continued, "knew her years ago, when her family still had a certain kind of usefulness to offer you. And a few of you stopped knowing her the moment that usefulness disappeared." Nobody moved. A few faces shifted, unwilling to meet his eyes. "I won't name names," Alexander said. "You already know who you are. And so does she." Amelia felt her pulse in her throat. She hadn't expected this. Not here. Not in front of everyone. "What I will say," Alexander continued, "is this. Amelia never once used what she had to buy her way back into rooms like this one. She could have. She chose not to. That's not the kind of woman who needs saving. That's the kind of woman who saves herself, quietly, while everyone else is busy deciding she doesn't matter. He turned to her. Her worth was never something the rest of you got to decide. It never needed your approval to be real. Amelia's eyes filled, but she didn't look away from him. Somewhere in the back rows, a cousin who'd sent a text with 3 exclamation points looked down at her hands. Alexander took Amelia's hand in front of everyone, the same way he had that day in the restaurant. Except this time, there was no crowd to correct. Only witnesses to a truth that had already been settled weeks earlier. Quietly, in phone calls nobody in this room had heard. "This is Amelia Sutton," he said. "The woman I chose. Not the woman anyone decided she should become." The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was real. The kind that happens when a room realizes it's just watched something honest happen in a space usually reserved for performance. Amelia stood there, hand in his, surrounded by 300 strangers, and felt something settle in her chest she hadn't expected. Not triumph. Something quieter. Something closer to peace. She thought about the woman who'd sat alone in that restaurant, waiting to be told to leave. She thought about every relative who'd suddenly remembered her name once it became valuable again, and how easily she'd let each of them go without raising her voice once. None of them were standing beside her tonight. Only the one person who'd never needed convincing. If you've ever wondered what real loyalty costs, this is it. It's not the people who show up once you're valuable. It's the people who stayed when you weren't. Amelia had exactly one of those beside her tonight, and it was enough. The applause hadn't fully died down when Alexander turned to her. "Your turn," he said quietly. "If you want it." Amelia hadn't planned anything. She hadn't expected to speak at all. But his words were still sitting in the room. The woman I chose, not the woman anyone decided she should become. And she realized there was something underneath them she needed to say herself, not have said on her behalf. She stepped forward. "He just told you who I am," she said, glancing at Alexander. "I'd like to tell you how I got here." The room quieted further, if that was even possible. 3 weeks ago, I was sitting alone at a table in Charleston, being told I didn't belong there. A woman I used to call a friend asked who could possibly love someone with nothing left to offer. Then 5 guards walked in, and a man in a coat like this one asked who had made his future Duchess cry. She let her eyes move across the room, past the cousin near the back who'd sent 3 exclamation points and a string of hearts, past the same face that had looked down at her hands only minutes earlier during Alexander's speech, now watching her properly for what might have been the first time in years. I used to think that was the moment everything changed. The cars. The crest. The coat. I stood in that private dining room afterward and thought, this is where my life turns around. She shook her head slightly. It wasn't. The turn happened 3 years earlier, in a much smaller room, with no cameras and no crest on any door. It happened the first time someone stopped calling and I decided not to chase them. It happened every morning I opened that design studio anyway, whether anyone thought I mattered or not. Her voice steadied. The guards didn't hand me my dignity that afternoon. They just made it impossible for anyone in that restaurant to keep pretending I didn't already have it. She paused, letting that settle the way Alexander's words had a few minutes earlier. If there's one thing I'd want anyone here to take from tonight, it's this. Don't wait for someone in a coat like this to walk through a door and prove your worth to a room that already decided you didn't have any. Prove it to yourself first, quietly, on the days nobody's watching. Everything after that is just confirmation. It was never the source. She turned to Alexander. He didn't rescue me. He arrived in time to watch me refuse to be someone's punchline. Those aren't the same thing, and I think it matters that people don't confuse the two. Alexander took her hand again. No announcement left to make, no title left to explain. Just 2 people standing in a room that had gone quiet out of respect instead of shock. The rest of the evening unwound slowly, the way these things do. Amelia found herself, at one point, talking with a member of Alexander's staff about nothing important at all. The same easy way she talked to the barista back home. Nothing about her had changed. That, more than the ceremony itself, seemed to be the detail people kept circling back to as the night went on. Near the end of it, the same cousin who'd sent that string of hearts approached her, hesitant. "I know I don't deserve much of your time," she said. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for tonight. For not calling 3 years ago, when it would have actually meant something." Amelia studied her for a moment. This one, at least, hadn't led with an excuse the way the others had. "Thank you for saying that," Amelia said. "That's more honest than most people managed this month." The text had been easy to close the door on. This, in person, uninvited, was harder to wave off. She didn't promise anything beyond it. Some doors stay closed. Some open a little. It was never cruelty, just attention to who had actually shown up, and when. Near midnight, Amelia stepped out onto a stone balcony overlooking the grounds, away from the noise. Alexander found her there a few minutes later. "Regrets?" he asked. "None," she said. "Just a lot to sit with." "Good sitting or hard sitting?" She smiled. "Both. That's usually how the important stuff feels." He put an arm around her. Below them, the last guests made their way to their cars, headlights sweeping slowly across the drive. No crests this time, no formation, no ceremony. Just an ordinary night ending the ordinary way. Amelia thought back to the freeze-frame moment from 3 weeks earlier. The laughter, the line about a real duke never marrying a woman like her, and understood, standing there, that the woman in that memory and the woman on this balcony had been the same person the entire time. She just wasn't waiting on anyone's permission to know it anymore.